So today,
Okay.
Joseph and I will both be speaking off and on. The broadest topics that we'll be discussing is supply chain, field to facility. As we've both discussed, there's a lot of sustainability and documentation there, quality control, manufacturing and testing. And then Joseph really will be talking about the regulatory world of guidelines and some different international guidelines that he would like to share and use some ingredients as case studies. We welcome your questions during our presentation. We hope that you can all mute until you want to speak and then unmute. That would be the most respectful, I think. And so if we don't get too distracted with questions, we'll continue to accept them. So in the beginning, we thought David mentioned about tea products and marketing. And so I thought I'd discuss just a few moments of how do you decide what to develop as a tea. And so at least at Celestial Seasonings, we used to sit around and talk about different ideas about what things people might want to be using, what people are already using, what needs there are, what are our competitors doing. Because at the time of Celestial Seasonings, no one even knew what hibiscus was. That is Hibiscus sabdariffa, not Rosa sinensis. It's a yellow flower, but it has a red calyx, right? The part that subtends the flower. And so no one even knew what that was, and yet we introduced that, and it went from there until competitors started introducing things, and therefore we had to start looking at what the public wanted, which changed the focus from basically introducing unique things. And so the market research became very important. But we really always wanted to know what the consumer wanted. Yet when the consumer drives a product, it's not always the best. And so sometimes it's nice to introduce things to consumers because they're not all knowing, as we have found out. And introducing those unique ingredients, like David was talking about in Africa, they're unique and people don't recognize them, so they don't know whether to purchase that. So what helps us to have chamomile, mint, hibiscus, some of the ones that people are familiar with, then introduce those unique ingredients and then start to focus those down the line. We also, as an ethnobotanist, I interview healers, native people from around the world to what they are consuming, and that requires quite a bit of IP, reciprocity, access, benefit sharing, and we will discuss that later on in the slideshow. And I don't know if Joseph, you wanted to add anything to this slide.
Yeah, I can give the perspective from a different herbal tea company in the United States, from Traditional Medicinals. The products, some of the products that the company has today, and the company was founded in 1974, a little bit after Celestial Seasonings, I believe. Some of the products that are the company's top sellers today were formulated in 1974. And the genesis of that was that the herbalist at the company also functioned as a community herbalist when the company was just regional and not national. So the formulations were formulas that people in the local community were using for coughs and sore throats and different conditions, and then they ended up becoming commercialized. There were formulas coming out of an herb shop, and then they became packaged, first regional, then national. And the interesting story, at least from my observations, that some of these products 46 years later are top sellers in every store in the country, and they really started out of community herbalism. So that's the point I wanted to add there.
So regardless of how it starts, thank you. Supply is really important, and this is Seminole Tribe past Chief Billy. And tea begins in the field, and you need to know what's out there. people just say, oh, you can grow it, but that's not really true. It takes a lot of work to be able to grow some things. And as you know, certainly in tropical areas, it's not so easy. You can't just plunk a seed or a plant in. There's a lot more that goes to it. And not only that, in getting yield, but also to make sure that the actives, in the case of traditional medicinals and other medicinally based products, the actives are present, versus a company like Celestial Seasonings that really works on flavor. You know, certainly hedonics are the highest criteria there to make sure it tastes the same each time and that it tastes good so that someone will buy it. So can you grow it? Is it only wild harvested? We call that, and the knowledge that comes from the traditional people called traditional ecological knowledge, which I think David said is indigenous knowledge systems for all of you, but we'll use those terms interchangeably, hopefully. And that often these reciprocity is government related, and that needs to be considered in the supply chain. And then who are the field associates? Now, field associates could be wild harvesters, they could be farmers, anybody who can supply the plant and has that knowledge base to be able to identify them and create a quality product. And then how also team members are supported. Is the reciprocity offering, in the case of a lot of the products coming from India, China, offering support for the field associates in the form of education, healthcare, you know, anything that they might request to improve the quality of their life? So Joseph, I'll let you add to that if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. And in our case, when we decide to use a new botanical, we do our research on its geographic origin, its traditional use, and what the production scenario is. And what we've determined over the years is that for batch-to-batch uniformity, for consistent composition and content, which is the basis for reproducible efficacy, we need to establish good trusting relationships through the whole value chain, right to the producer group. So we do not do anonymous buying. We need to know everybody, and that way we can troubleshoot, and we can also work with producers if need be to assist in the implementation of suitable JCPs with the target of attaining the specification that we're looking for. And as Trish pointed out before, you could be growing a crop for the purpose of optimizing you know, taste and color. You could be growing a crop or collecting a crop to be making certain that you're capturing the chemistry composition that you need for the finished product. So with regard to traditional ecological knowledge, we have voluntarily participated wherever we can in any programs where there are, for example, fair trade or fair wild or systems like this where access and benefit sharing is a component, and it's handled in different ways in different countries. And the thing to know, at least in the United States is, I think, the only country in the world that hasn't ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity, so a lot of US companies are not even aware of it, to tell the truth. But if you deal with a producer group in a country where there is high awareness and they're implementing it, a US company will be dealing with it one way or the other.
And we'll show a few case studies later that will talk about this. Do change the slide, David, thank you. So, you know, the supply chain is an area of focus for this talk, and there can never be enough documentation about what goes on, when it's planted, et cetera, et cetera. And then audit, and I'll go into detail later on, this is just an overview slide. And then, you know, my belief is that you audit every step that you take. You don't trust your vendor. You don't trust your supplier ever. You always test and then trust. We've learned that lesson with a lot of difficulty. This is the weakest area, as we'll show with some of the case studies. And what's happened is because there is a weakness, people every buyer of material is requesting an audit, and this has driven the prices up so much that, and then additional testing. And so the goal, when I was working with retailers such as Walmart and GNC and a few others, Whole Foods from the United States, we decided that we would create audits with certifying bodies such as USP, NSF, UL, and we would tell people that these audits were sufficient, and then in addition, if they wanted more auditing, they could pay for that. So that was one way we were trying to resolve it, by creating an oversight of that. And just a general comment, you can never fix quality in. You can't harvest something and have a lot of contamination, just like mold, bacteria, maybe even contamination with other, adulteration with other parts of the plant or other plants. It just becomes worse. You kind of spread the contamination or adulteration. So you need to start with quality and maintain it. If there's one thing that I think Joseph and I feel strongly about, this is the message that we can get across to you. Start in the field and make sure, and we'll move through some things to show you how to do that. Joseph?
Yeah, that's right. And the testing, by the time you test the product and it's in your warehouse and you find a problem, it gives you, you might not be able to use that batch, but it gives you data so that if you have good relationships through the whole value chain, you can go back and you can work together to solve that problem for the future. So for example, let's say your testing shows that you have foreign alkaloids in your chamomile. You have pyrrolizidine alkaloids or tropine alkaloids or even nicotine. These are things you can find in your herbal tea batch. Once you have those results, and then you can go back and do the field work and find out how the contamination is happening. And sometimes it's pretty easy. Nicotine contaminates crops just through fumigation. So if you go back and you find all the workers are smoking, it actually sticks and you can detect it later on. So you can figure out the problems and then work on strategies to prevent them from happening in the future.
Okay, next slide, David. So as we're talking, it's know your ingredients. And we've talked a lot about this, and we just can't emphasize it enough, that this creates a sustainable industry, that it protects you from not having adverse reactions. In the United States, we have to report adverse reactions. So if someone is getting a true adverse reaction, and there are a lot of people who are what we call ambulance chasers, who aren't really having it but just want additional money or whatever in a litigious society, you can prevent that, and you will know ahead of time every step, and therefore this gives you a lot of security in general. So with good science, there's no question about quality. There's only health and healing. Anything
I don't have anything to add. You can go ahead.
Okay. So, we start in the field. We mentioned GACPs, which is good agricultural practices, but we also have a high percentage of our ingredients are wild harvested, almost as much as 80% in some cases, even though there's a huge tonnage of agriculturally provided materials. A lot of it is GAP, GCP, good collection practices. And I was participating as Joseph in 2006 when we wrote our first APA guidelines, and they have been updated since then. We had looked at the WHO guidelines and we felt that that wasn't adequate, that we needed additional guidelines in there. Where were you harvesting? Where's your water from? What was there electrical lines? Are there mines upstream? Who used the land before? Is it contaminated? So there's a lot of information to know both before cultivating and wild harvesting. The next step would be, once you look at that and have gathered enough information about the properties and where you're harvesting, you want to create your specifications. There's no exceptions of that. If you don't have specifications, you have no recourse in case something is wrong. Someone can return a product because you haven't said, you know, this is how we are, and this is what we're providing, and these are the materials. And that does include testing, et cetera, guidelines in there. So the specifications, and the one that I think is neglected, which I'll talk about later as well, is that people will list the name of the product, but they don't write a test next to it of how they identify that. And so there are botanical tests that do that, such as vouchers, and I'll mention that. So you must test for contaminants. There's a lot of times there's known contaminants, and you can test for those, but otherwise it can be E. coli, it could be salmonella, it's certainly yeast and mold at a minimum. There's also testing for pesticides, and we also alluded to vendor certification. If you know your vendor, as Joseph's been saying, you can be sure, because they're going to inform you about any issues, that you will have a pure product. And so that's very important, and there are guidelines on how to create that, and therefore you don't have to test every time you receive a material in-house, but you'll know that that vendor has been approved, and that the testing is intermittent instead of continual. So I think that I'm just going to move through because I know we're taking a lot of time here. So, you know, you want to begin this GMPs with the quality in the field. Joseph, did you want to add anything to that? Sorry.
No, it's the specifications that need to be, what I wanted to say is about SOPs. So that's the next slide, is that the GACPs, of course, is a general document, but of course, an operation needs to then write corresponding SOPs that are species specific and site specific. And if the operation has more than one crop, they'll need a different SOP for each crop. One might be a leaf crop, another a root crop, and a flower crop that are handled in different ways. And the other point to consider is that the earth is not a clean place anymore. So you really can't mitigate and prevent all contamination. So your specifications tell you what the reasonable limits are. The regulations in the United States say that you must have a specification, a limit in the test for all contaminants, known contaminants for the crop, for the botanical crop. So that's based on data. So if your historical data shows you that a certain plant's a heavy metals accumulator, then site selection comes into play and limits. What are the reasonable limits for that? If it's near an urban area or just in a bad place with regard to where the way the wind blows, your pesticide residues could be airborne. So you have to set reasonable limits and test for them and meet those, and then you can. The main point I want to make about GACPs, I found that two of the most important parts of the GACPs are the requirement that they're specifications that should be based on regional or national standards, but also site selection. In my experience, I've found that operations have really not been able to meet specifications just because of where they are. And so finding the right place to do it where you can minimize contamination is becoming really critical.
Yeah, in fact, one of the things that's been invisible that Joseph brought up in last few years is that pyrrolizidine alkaloids have been penetrating and often in the soil and have been contaminating. And so we've had to test that since it's hepatotoxic, and that things like comfrey, which is Symphytum officinale, or Symphytum uplandicum, is often used as a composting or intermediate planting, has pyrrolizidine alkaloids, and that has been contaminating the soil. Contaminating the soil. Sorry. So you know, SOPs need to be written as much as specs, because this will give you your consistency through your product. So, you know, we keep talking about documentation, and we can't emphasize that enough. And, you know, if you haven't written it down, well, maybe it wasn't done. You cannot trust. So be careful there. And the other document that's really critical in teas and raw materials is your certificate of analysis, the C of A. And that lists everything you've done, the name of the plant, your common name, all the tests you've done, the contaminants that we've been talking about, and the test methods. If you list them, but you don't have a test method, was it tested properly? And there's lots of tests out there in AOAC or certain areas. Having your own test really isn't the best way. And so we really emphasize that. So The next part of my slideshow is a little more fun because it's got great pictures. And I've been emphasizing botany because so many problems have happened with misidentification, and that can be a toxic issue. And so I can't emphasize enough that you research and identify your materials through botanical floras, local texts, and then making sure that you have a voucher specimen that you can use as an image on your certificate of analysis. And it has a huge amount of label information identifying. Could you put on the next slide, David? Identifying that. And this, this is a herbarium case. Oh, that I changed the color of that. Sorry, it's hard to read. But you need to use either a botanist or a very qualified field collector if you're doing wild materials to make sure you have the right plant. And this does not replace chemistry. You cannot do HPTLC or HPLC without having a good reference. And therefore, you have to start in a botanical industry with botany. And this is herbarium case for those of you who might not know. You would put them on archival paper that the previous slide had shown, and that will last hundreds of years. In fact, specimens from Darwin's journeys are in herbaria around the world. So if you don't have a case like this, this is a fireproof, bug-proof case. They're a little expensive, but they are available. And if you can get that, fine. If you use a regular wooden shelf or something, please try and make it insect-proof, especially in your areas where there's a huge amount of humidity that can rot some of these things. So Joseph, I don't know if you have anything to add here. I was kind of I'm going to go through a little faster through the next slides.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, David. And so, next slide. So as part of these documentation, starting in the field, is the identity is the first thing. But then there are other records that are such as farm records. You know, what are you growing? When are you growing it? Where's the origin of the seed? What's the weather? When you planted? What's the date? When did you put amendments on, such as manures or fertilizers? Did you apply any chemicals before planting, during, afterwards? And then there's something called a botanical collection form, which I'll show you next. But all of these create this chain of custody so that any step in the process from the planting or even before, like we're talking about site selection, has been documented. And if there's any problems, you can go back and look at these issues to see where this happened. And this also includes the audit forms that I'll speak about later. Joseph?
Go ahead.
Okay. So this is a collection form that I've established. Again, here's another voucher specimen. And this information gives you the voucher number so that there's full traceability. Not only do you have identification, but you have a unique number that goes from the beginning of this plant when it's planted or harvested all the way through production. And so you can always trace back. You have the date, you have local languages, you have the scientific family, who identified this, and then details about where it was. So if you need to go back to this exact location, especially in the case of a pharmaceutical company or in a tea company that's looking at actives, you know exactly where this is from. And then there's a little bit of ecological information that you can get. Is this the only plant for miles or kilometers around? Or, and when is the only time you could harvest according to your indigenous knowledge that you've acquired about this plant? Are there permits? And that's probably the most important thing about wild harvesting is permits, and I'll talk a little more later. And then what's most critical on this document, and to be able to put the label, which is on the lower right part of this archival voucher, is where was it collected? What kind of environment, you know? And so in the case of, let's say, black cohosh, just a minute before you change that, there was a boom in black cohosh when it was shown to be effective for menopause. And so we went from a few pounds per month to 400 pounds per month mainly. And so all of a sudden people in Germany wanted to plant that. And they were planting it in an open field in full sun, where in the Carolinas in the southeast of our country, it grows in what they call hollers, where there's not much sun, a lot of moisture, and a lot of other plants. And so this habitat is very important. And then the description of the plant, the exact shape of the leaf, how it's attached to this is a botanical identification process that I spoke about. It's not chemical, but it's botanical. And you can be sure that this is the plant because of the shape of the leaves, how it attached, and the full description of the flower. To me, this is the most important and credible step in the process. And so all of this information gets put into the label that's on the bottom right, and is valid in a court of law in case there's ever any litigious activity by consumers. So I wanted to show a few case studies. In doing some field audits in the United States, this is cranberry, Vaccinium is the genus. And actually what was fascinating was that a batch or lot number was assigned when the truck arrived to receive the materials. So full traceability at that point and then earlier on. You can, next slide. This is a water process. It's a shallow field that you can see, but what happens is that it grows and then is flooded for harvest because the fruit can then rise up. And so they have developed specific equipment like a tractor that can go through with tines and rotate through the water so that it's plucking these off of the low-growing plant. And then they put this barrier around and keep shrinking it as they literally vacuum up the berries and they rake them to the smaller and smaller area. Next slide, please. And then they take them with a water process into the truck I showed you. And so the quality of the water, the source of the water, and you can see how clean this product is. There's no contamination. They've sorted it at the base of this conveyor belt that's coming out of the vacuum from the pond, or what they call bogs, and the leaf material and other contaminant that might enter into the manufacturing process is shunted off to one side, where the clean product is then put into the into the truck. Next slide. And Joseph, interrupt me if you need to add anything to these crops. Here's a good example. This is in India. This is a marigold field from OmniActives, and this is used in production of making a highly processed ingredient, not for teas necessarily, but for eye health care. So the lutein is taken from this product. But they have full custody. They've done a lot of research to get a specific seed that they've certified, that they provide to these local farmers. And as you know, the farmers are fairly dressed up because we're visiting. I'm not sure they would be this attractive in their dress. I would think that they were working clothes, but it was exquisite in this field to see all the colors and the people. And they have a huge documentation trail here in which they have farmers filling out forms that are laminated so they can continue when they harvest, when they plant, what the weather is, and that goes to a field manager, that goes to a project manager, that gets inputted into computers later on in the process. But it's fully documented, and these are beautiful, and they handpick because they pop off, and they don't need to use any equipment, so that helps with the cleaning of equipment, the contamination of equipment, etc. Next slide.
Yes, you mentioned that the company provides the seeds to the smallholder farmers. That's such an important point, and especially in India. I've had situations where I'm dealing with a quality issue in the field in India, and then when you get down to the seeds and you find that different farmers in the same cooperative or in the same village who are selling into the same first buyer in the value chain bought seeds separately off the market rather than having them provided. So it just leads to all sorts of inconsistencies. So There are cases where even the final buyer in the value chain, it's in their best interest to be involved with the provision of seeds for a consistent crop all the way to the field.
Yeah. So this documentation, as we've been speaking, is really important. This picture is actually the end, not the end product, but the end part of the raw material in the sense. And that the fields you saw are harvested, they're covered, and they're immediately brought to the facility, even if it's hours away, and put into a slight fermentation area that allows for the plant material to rot a little bit, to get off the parts of the plant that are not necessary, and then it's put through a drying, which is highly monitored, and then placed into a pill form and sorted and labeled into these bags. So next slide. And then it goes to extraction. I wanted to talk about kind of a funny thing. This is Camellia sinensis, and when the beginning of decaf tea started, the product that was used was on the left. It tastes terrible. The product on the right is the 2 in a bud, which is really the best quality of tea. It has the volatiles, it has the caffeine, it's got all the properties that you want in a tea product. And I'm talking about black or green tea here. But in order to reduce the caffeine, they took plant leaves from the lower or older area, which were highly astringent. And this is just a bad policy. So I was just showing some bad ingredient sourcing here. And this is chamomile. This is in Egypt. It is a hand-harvested product because we found that you can see that the flowers mature at different times. And when the flower is highly, is open or most mature, that's when the components, the azoline, the chemazoline, that are anti-inflammatory components, giving a blue oil, are most active. And so people are requested to go back into the field and get the plant, the flowers as they mature. And we don't want the green part. It's the flower that's most important. So when you harvest with a machine, you're getting a lot of the green and you're getting a lot of immature flowers. And it's not very appropriate for use because of the flavor. And you can see in the next slide. Oh, I'm sorry. But anyway, this is fine. But I also wanted to show you when they get it into, when they're sorting it, you can see how they sort it. And check out this guy. You know, we were talking about contamination with cigarettes. Here's the perfect example. So this ashes are just dropping. They're in a facility, which is a huge improvement than doing this out in the open. And you can see they have boxes and labels, etc. So this is almost good, but not quite good. So next slide. Here's another example of some bad behavior of drying, which in most countries, you know, there isn't a facility for drying. This is peanuts on the side of a ginkgo farm where I was auditing, and the animals are just going through and eating, and of course they leave deposits as well. So anytime you're in open air, you have an issue of contamination. Next slide. So this was a slide I obviously should have put earlier. This is from, Joseph, what's the name of this book? Anyway, it's an excellent microscopy book. It's in German, it's an author's German, and it's also been translated, and it talks about a lot of the tea ingredients, and it shows you methodologies, and it's a microscopy text mostly. So it shows you microscopy, it shows you some other aspects of testing, it'll talk about testing, and you can see here, Joseph is holding up the book, thank you, that there are 2 types of chamomile. And so there's a German and the Roman, and they have very different names, you know, Anthemis nobilis versus Matricaria chamomilla. And the way to tell this is to see on this lower right part is the hollow ovary right there. And that certainly confirms that you've got the right German chamomile And you can also see the different quality levels I was talking about. If you see the flower there, you can see that it doesn't even have petals on some of them, so it won't taste very good. Anyway, I'm going to stop here and see if Joseph has anything. I've been pushing through some slides.
That's fine. You know, in chamomile, traditionally there's a chamomile comb that you hold in your hand so you can pull the capitula off the top. That is the traditional way of doing it, and that is the best way. I would have to say, unfortunately, most big operations have moved to mechanical harvesting, and they have to do all sorts of post-harvest tricks to separate out the parts and prevent contamination. Chamomile in Europe is usually it's in a meadow, so they broadcast the seeds. So it's not a row crop. The whole meadow fills with chamomile. And so then there's actually no way to weed. So when you come in with the mechanical harvesters, depending on the height of the plant, you'll inevitably pick up some weeds. And there are many PA-containing weeds in Europe that will cohabitate with the chamomile. So at least in Europe, it's become a big problem for chamomile being done that way. And people have gone to mechanical harvesting. So the way they deal with this, there's companies now that manufacture chamomile specific post-harvest equipment for separating and sorting the plant parts, and they end up taking it all apart, the florets, the flower heads, the stems, leaves, the pollen, powder, and all of that into separate pieces, and then they recombine it depending on the specification. It's really laborious, but it somehow ends up still being, I guess, economical.
And PA stands for pyrrolizidine alkaloids, which I had mentioned. And we talk about chamomile. I talked about chamomile because I'm pretty sure you can grow it. It grows everywhere. So go back. It's fine. You can go to this. Is a hibiscus. And we, at Celestial Seasonings, this was our largest crop because red beverages sell better than others. Don't ask me why, but that's true. And so we had created these solar dryers thinking we'd be really great. But guess what? You can see there's standing water. So there was a ton of water. So this vendor or supplier thought that they were help us. And so they lit fires underneath them to dry this. And so by the time we got the hibiscus, it was like barbecue tasting hibiscus. And we had to spend a lot of time sorting this. So I'm just showing you some bad examples. You can see they're on nice drying racks, but the problem did exist. Keep going. Another issue is that arnica, which is more of a temperate plant, is mixed. And so a lot of people go to Mexico to get products because of the lower costs, but they're not always identified the same. And so the product actually does grow in California, Colorado, and Arnica cordifolia because it's a heart-shaped leaf you can see in the top. And the trichomes, or the hairs on the leaves, are very diagnostic and can distinguish the plant. And so this is an excellent identification tool. And you can see that Arnica montana in the lower left corner, they have bifid or two-parted ends to this trichome, the hair, and you can see that they're different lengths compared to the arnica shown above, the Arnica cordifolia. Now, if you look in the next slide, there's an arnica that has the same use, but comes from Mexico, and you can see how long that trichome is. It's a different genus, it's Heterothecia inuloides. So here are issues where you need to make sure that you don't have a contamination. If you are not growing it, if you're not vertically integrated, identification is very critical to make sure that your end product is what you want, and you will have the taste and activity that's required. Next slide, please. So those were some examples of cultivation that we talked about. I wanted to isolate wildcrafting and some of the examples, good and bad, that we can share. We talked about some guidelines that are established from APA, Fair Wild, WHO. Again, contamination is really important. Like Joseph just mentioned in chamomile, I have an example in the next few slides that show some very toxic issues. You have to be extremely careful what your weeds are if you're wild harvesting. And when people go through, they often have multiple bags that they're wild harvesting for different companies. So they can get mixed up if they're working for a pharmaceutical, in the case of something like Atropa belladonna. In the case of comfrey, was a big issue for Celestial Seasonings. We had to stop the products basically because we couldn't get it pure. And we had a national recall of all of our teas because it had created some illness, only in 1 or 2 cases, but we did a voluntary recall, which is a marketing nightmare and a operations nightmare. Believe me, you don't want that. But because we had good paperwork, we could identify where that came from and what. Yet, even though we had documentation and looked at different samples in the laboratory where I was working at Celestial Seasonings, we didn't see it. So unless you're looking at everything, and if you're doing tonnage, you can't look at every part. So you have to have multiple checks and balances. One of the main things about wild harvesting I mentioned earlier is to have permission. If you're going on private or public lands, you need to get permission. This is so important for your field associates that you need to emphasize as part of your behavior in your collection. And then again, contamination through sanitation. The first contamination I spoke of is identification. I'll show you some examples in the following slides. This here is sanitation because you're harvesting and you just didn't clean it well enough. And then the labeling is very important here. Where did you get it from? When did you get it? Who collected it so you have recourse? And what is the plant? I'm sure you have something to say, Joseph, on wild harvesting.
Yeah, sure. So the Fair Wild system, the Fair Wild initiative is something I've been involved with over the past couple of decades. Its genesis actually starts in the year 2000, but this is a system that requires that trainers, collectors are trained. The areas are mapped and inspected, audited, certified, and there are monographs, plant monographs, and identification tools to identify what you're collecting, what quality you're collecting, when, and exactly where. There are collection points, and the authorized collectors within the area put together the same information that Trish is talking about. A lot number is assigned, and the sacks are weighed and labeled as they come to the collection point, demonstrating that they've collected within compliance with the standard. And the producers who are Fair Wild certified operations have annual audits by accredited control bodies who also have periodic training on the standard. So I can say that I have a lot of experience with that standard, and I've seen how it works. It's rigorous. I have to say a lot of wild collection operations shy away from it because it is difficult. It's not easy. There's one Fair Wild there's two. There's 2 Fair Wild certified operations in Africa. So one in Zimbabwe for baobab, and there's another one. I'm not sure which country. I think Kenya for some frankincense resin. So
the only comment I have, I support what Joseph just said. But one time when I was doing an audit in Nicaragua, some of those guidelines are pretty hard to follow because there isn't a bathroom nearby. Even in those pictures that I showed you of the marigolds, the tagetes, the local people didn't live too far. So having a bathroom near the field wasn't a possibility. Also, there were children in the field, and that was not child labor. There was no money for a nursery or things like that, which sometimes Fair Wild would like to support and or does support. And so it was just a community thing where the children were playing around and sometimes collecting. In this case, it was coffee. And, so anyway, you have to look at the realism of this. If you are getting a certification, you need to look at how realistic some of this is to apply for you. So in this slide, we had a contamination. This is Passiflora incarnata. At Celestial Seasonings, we were having such high mold contents that we were having trouble using this plant, which is often used in our sleepy time, one of our biggest cellars for sleep. And so what we did was, like Joseph had mentioned, we go back and we work with these farmers. The equipment was not appropriate. We had human equipment in this case, and it was really helpful because what we did in wanting the leaves is just say, look, cull out all the fruit as much as possible, because that gave us insects, it gave us mold. And so by the time we started harvesting, all we had was leaves, and that made a huge difference. Another problem was that this was always wild harvested. And in the wild harvest, we were getting Abrus precatorius, a phytolectin that was highly toxic, and if people weren't using boiling water, which they often don't, just part of a seed could kill you. And certainly if children were drinking the tea. So wild harvesting, we stopped that because we could not really control that. They were wild integrated. Actually, we went to cultivation in this case because we could in Guatemala. Next slide. Another example is I was in China doing an audit on epimedium, and epimedium is wild harvested. The supplier would not take me to the field. They thought, oh, that's so difficult, so far away. And I'm saying, yes, but I need to go. And they refused. So I said, well, at least can I see where it's stored? So these men were so proud of their material. This was stored, as you can see, ripped bags thrown into a garage. The storage was awful. There was no ventilation. There was dirt. There was no labeling. It was really bad. And I took a sample and made a voucher specimen and found out this was the wrong species. So I had to tell my client that they had an adulterated product, and before they had everything removed from the shelf, they needed to fix this part. Now, I didn't suggest cutting out the supplier, but to go back and talk to the supplier, because building trusting relationships is most important. And in this case, it didn't really matter that it was a different species because they were isolating a compound from it, which also was available from this species. So as long as they labeled it properly, and the C of A was properly labeled, it did not matter that this was a different species. So, but the Sagittatum species is what everyone recognizes. Yet this was therefore a marketing issue of just using a different species for the same use. Next slide. So I wanted to move forward on reciprocity. I know we've talked a lot about the field, but in our experience of 100 years, it is very much the most important part of your process to make sure you've got identification and quality and therefore consistency. And so, but we feel very strongly, me as an ethnobotanist and as an ethical person, I think, which is true about most of the people here, certainly Joseph and David, about creating long-term relationships with people and meaningful benefits and making sure they're profitable. It's not what you think that people want, you need to ask them. This is very much a participatory event in which you need to say to your suppliers, and especially if you're working with Native people to identify leads or ingredients, what is it that you need most? And then you need to see if that is reasonable. People have asked us to pave 20 miles of road, which isn't reasonable, but we could fly in a dentist or a doctor in remote areas, or create some opportunities such as educational tools. So in part of that is training. In the case of Leon Sequeterra here, this was a field site which I was trying to identify how much can be harvested of a wild plant called Ligusticum porteri, or OSHA, only grows in the Rocky Mountains, and therefore it's at a high altitude, so it's very limited. This man, being he's passed away, but he was a Canyoncito Navajo man, and he came and he blessed the land, and he worked with us, as you can see, and he offered us his insights. So you want to do that in everywhere you work. We had created a research tool to see how much to harvest. I had the same projects, different projects going on in the high mountains in China or Tibet on Tibetan ingredients because they wanted to market these ingredients. We want to make sure that we could harvest them because a lot of them were wild harvested. So we did a lot of marketing research, which is the slide in the upper left, and we did a lot of environmental stewardship. And if you look at the next slide, one of the other things that we did was in a project that I was working on independently in Alaska, working with Inupiaq people that you might know as Eskimos. I had asked them to collect the plants that we were researching for a possible pharmaceutical through talking to their elders. And so some of the local people living in these remote communities, I had trained to be parataxonomists. In other words, collecting the voucher specimens that I showed earlier and pressing them so that when I would come back in a few weeks, they had collected materials and I could use them, therefore creating local income and knowledge base that they could use in case anyone else wanted to come into that area and create some opportunities for them. Next slide. In the form of reciprocity is product development. I showed you this picture before. I worked with the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Mashantucket Pequot tribe, both Native Americans on the eastern coast of our country. And we spoke with them about their knowledge base, and they were very concerned about sharing that because the health food trade is a place where people do a lot of self-diagnosis. They were afraid that the karma would come back to them, and they were not comfortable in sharing their knowledge base about which herbs or formulas to use. So we created other forms of reciprocity with them. And it was quite a beautiful product. And what happened was we engaged another native area, which was local herbalists, and we used them to create opportunities, some that were from Africa, some from Thailand, and from America. Next slide. And I know I'm skipped over, and I know Joseph had things to add, but I think in his presentation that will follow this next couple slides, he'll be able to offer that. But I know there's a lot of you who are interested in the facility, and we don't have a lot of slides because people do not allow you into their facility to take pictures. But all the things that we've talked about need to be repeated inside facilities, and the materials have to be strictly regulated and they have to be documented. So not only does the documentation doesn't stop, but then you have receiving and shipping documentation. You have in-house testing or outside laboratory support. These are all dictated by our government, by FDA. They don't approve products, but they have guidelines in which we follow. And I'm assuming that your regulators would have some of the same things. Again, consistency is going to be based on contamination, and therefore sanitation is most critical. And the sanitation is done by the cleaning. At Celestial Seasonings and TM, in which Joseph can talk about, we were very lucky to be a large company, and so we could buy large amounts of things and clean them and mill them to our specifications, which allows us to know what the contamination sanitation issue is. So if you are buying materials from someone that are pre-cut, cut and sifted in tea bag size, or further cut, which can create some problems. Anyway, you might not know that. And so doing some industrial espionage, we took some of the tea bags from some of our competitors and we opened them and saw, and an example was orange blossoms. There were so many twigs because a lot of it's gathered on the ground instead of putting netting under the tree to gather the blossoms. And so there was so much contamination, and it didn't even have blossoms in it. So you have to be very careful there about that. So cleaning is very species specific. If you're doing something like nutmeg that has a lot of oils, you might have to freeze down your equipment in order to get the mill working. The types of mills that you want are going to be determined by the type of ingredients that you're using. The cleaning, I'll go backwards first. The cleaning, you might want to be blowing things up to get rid of feathers and light materials so that your ingredient actually falls down is called heavy. And then you might try and clean that on a gravity felt, a piece of equipment that's vibrating, which will get your rocks and dirt out. So there's a lot of equipment in there. We don't really have a lot of time today. Hopefully we can go through that at a later time when we do a workshop. But these are very specific and you need to look at them. When milling, the biggest problems were for me lemongrass, because the grass shoots out and is missed by the mill a lot. So if you're doing lemongrass, which certainly can grow in Africa, be able to mill that appropriately. And also things like hawthorn were so hard that when the guy came to demonstrate the equipment, he broke it. So you need to know your ingredients and you need to interview quite a few equipment people to get that correct. The next step would be your production and your packaging. And so you need to know if you want open tea, which allows a visual contamination to be seen if you haven't cleaned it appropriately. We found that cutting it down to tea bag size and putting it in tea bags was more convenient. People could slip them into their briefcases or purses and carry it with them and have tea at any time. And we had greater control over that. But we wanted to make sure we didn't have a lot of garbage, and we wanted to make sure that we weren't attracting insects. So having an inner liner that protects your product so it smells good when you open it, prevents the smell from attracting insects, and an overwrap, which maybe is important for both those issues, is quite critical. So there's a lot of issues in packaging. You certainly want it attractive. You want it to jump off the shelf so that someone goes, wow, this box is really nice. Let's try it. And both in storage of the finished product and the raw materials, you want to be very careful where you place these things. Things that have volatile oils in them should not be placed next to materials that might absorb those. So in the case of tea, you don't want to put tea next to mint, because then all of your tea, meaning black tea, Camellia sinensis, would smell like mint. And so one of the things that we did at Celestial Seasonings is we had separate rooms for mint and a separate room for tea, the black tea. And when we did tours of consumers, which we did frequently, you could open up this garage door, more or less, and the wafting of the volatiles will make your eyes tear. So if you had a cold, it was great. But the storage is important, where you store it, off the ground, away from the walls. There's all sorts of GMPs to follow. And so Joseph might want to add something here. This is the end of my slides. This is a slide of where the ginkgo was that I audited. You can see how clean this is. You could eat off the floor. This is a manufacturing, a highly processed materials, and so they're extracting the actives of the ginkgo for encapsulation here. Not appropriate for the tea that we've been talking about, but I just wanted to show you this as an example of the sanitation here. So I'm going to turn my the screen over to Joseph, and he can add whatever I didn't allow him to say because of the time as I was running through those. And hopefully we're stimulating some questions if you have them towards the end of our presentation.